So I'm frequently asked, is Ukraine winning or is Russia winning? And we're going to talk about that because that's an important point that we ought to be trying to figure out definitionally what's actually happening. So if you just type in, how do you define winning a war? You'll get an AI overview that'll say winning a war in a war is defined by achieving the political objectives for which the war was fought rather than solely by military victories, right? Like you can win on the ground and still lose the political military objective. By that definition, it doesn't look like Russia's winning. Now, it doesn't also look like Ukraine's winning, but I'm going to add something to that by that definition. So what we're really talking about, what we're really thinking through and trying to get to is a decisive victory. Now, a decisive victory is a military victory in a battle that definitely resolves the objective being fought over, ending one stage of the conflict, maybe perhaps beginning another, until a decisive victory is achieved. Conflict over the competing objectives will continue. So a decisive victory is something like this. This is the end of World War II. This is the Japanese signing the unconditional surrender to the American forces and Allied forces assembled there. Okay, that's decisive victory. Are you going to see something like that? Don't know. But I know that the Russians haven't achieved that, and that's part of the definition here. I went and tried to find out, okay, so Clausewitz and his definition of what does that winning mean to him, and Sun Tzu. So let's look at Clausewitz. Key definition of winning is to continue. So war is a continuation of politics by other means. Okay, that's fundamental to his thinking. So the Russians are continuing politics by means of trying to drive the Ukrainians down because they wanted to control the Ukrainians, and because they couldn't control them with a puppet governor who would do whatever the Russians wanted him to do, they're continuing by war. So winning actually means compelling the enemy to fulfill your will. Is Russia compelling the enemy, that is Ukraine, to fulfill its will? No, I would say not. In fact, it looks amplified. Okay, so now the Ukrainians are not compelling the Russians to fulfill their will either. Yes, I understand that. But the fight seemed unbalanced, right? This is AI, so don't freak out or YouTube be kind to me. This is just an AI illustration for educational purposes. It's like Russia was like 3 times Ukraine's size. It's 12 time zones, many times the GDP. It looked like Russia was going to just roll onto the playground and take over, right? And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen. And it's remarkable because we're like 433 3-day wars into it, right? It was supposed to go on for 3 days, and Putin thought he was going to roll right in because he got bad intelligence saying that the Ukrainians would just welcome them with open arms because they really want to be more closely aligned with Russia, and it didn't really work out. That 433 3-day wars later, here we are. Now, then you also have the definition from Sun Tzu. We talked about the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Okay, so were they able to subdue the enemy without fighting? No. They're not successful there. Success lies in breaking the enemy's resistance before battle through strategy, deception, alliances, psychological advantage. If fighting is necessary, the aim is swift, efficient, economical campaigns. Was it swift, efficient, or economical campaigns? You know, we're 1,300 plus days later. So you could argue that by Sun Tzu's definition, Russia's been fairly successful in Georgia by overtaking the government and legally, well, illegally with the false election, but then legally saying that they're in charge and fighting that way. They could be successful there, but they're not successful in Ukraine. Okay, here's another definition I'd like you to consider. Plokhy is a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard. He says victory means denying the enemy its objectives. Okay, it's just inverting it. By that standard, it looks like Ukraine has done a really good job at denying Russia its objectives of taking over, of controlling with a puppet, of controlling the country, whatever it is. Ukraine's done a pretty good job. And remember, the burden is like in an argument, when you make an assertion, the burden's on you to prove it. The burden's on Russia to really try to make this thing happen. Ukraine's just defending. Putin's goal is to deny Ukraine's nationhood, rooted in history. Preserving nationhood is essential for victory. Ukraine has already won battles of nationhood and identity. And that's really important because Ukraine's more united than it's been in a long time. In the last 3.5 years, it's created more heroes and mythology than in the previous 150. Forming a narrative to unite Ukraine, unlike World War II, preserving identity requires a sovereign state. And again, I think Ukraine's been pretty successful in denying Russia its objectives. Now, does that mean that Ukraine has been successful in pushing Russia out? No, it hasn't, but it still survives, like the beginning of its national anthem. Okay, as the war grinds on, Ukraine faces a staggering financial burden of $120 billion a year just to defend itself and to rebuild. President Zelensky warned that if the war stretches into 2026, half that sum, $60 billion, must come from Western partners. So they're trying to figure out how to go about doing that, how to get that international support from Western partners. Here it is in the Kyiv Post. End of the war end the war or find $120 billion to hold off Russia. Price of this war is $120 billion. $60 billion comes from our own budget. I need to find another $60 billion. Like, that's what he has to do in his day job, is find another $60 billion. I hope we will end this war, but in any case, we have two options. Plan A, end the war. Plan B, secure $120 billion. This is a huge challenge. I'll say that is a huge challenge. Meanwhile, Russia has sharply increased its own defense spending in the first half of 2025. Do you really think that Russia wants to be where they are, where they're having to increase their own defense spending to $100 billion because they haven't been able to take little Ukraine in this fight 1,300 days later and change? They don't want to be there. Meanwhile, Ukraine and Poland are establishing a joint task force for unmanned aerial systems. That attack the other day, the 20 drones, has shown Poland they really need this. Poland needs Ukraine more than Ukraine needs Poland. And I'm not saying be ungrateful or anything along those lines. I'm saying Poland's just realized they really need what Ukraine has. Corresponding memorandum was signed today in Kyiv, today with Poland's Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of National Defense. Poland's also shut down China's gateway to Europe. So this could go weird. Like what? So it was shut down during the Belarusian wargaming, but it could become a flashpoint. Politico reports that Poland's closure of its borders with Belarus has crippled a key EU-China trade route. Rail freight worth an estimated $25 billion a year has effectively ground to a halt. Up to 90% of cargo on the New Silk Road passes through this Polish corridor. The border will remain closed indefinitely. Yeah, we'll see how that plays out. Meanwhile, Slovakia and Hungary pushed back against Trump's pressure to cut Russian oil and gas imports, saying that they won't move until the EU provides reasonable alternatives. Slovak economy minister warned that acting prematurely could seriously damage their industry and economy. I don't know what's premature about 3.5 years of this war. Like, you had time. Like, you could have done this beforehand. Everybody else is converted. Slovakia and Hungary said that they would resist pressure from the Trump administration to cut oil and gas imports. Again, this is according to Bloomberg. Meanwhile, Trump is visiting the United Kingdom. King Charles is here speaking during an event, a dinner. This was like a big honor for Trump to be invited by the king for this dinner. And he says this:
our countries have the closest defense, security, and intelligence relationship ever known. In 2 world wars, we fought together to defeat the forces of tyranny. Today, as tyranny once again threatens Europe, we and our allies stand together in support of Ukraine to deter aggression and secure peace.
So he was getting his points in. Then you saw Keir Starmer getting his talking points in.
In recent days, Putin has shown his true face, mounting the biggest attacks since the invasion began. with yet more bloodshed, yet more innocents killed, and unprecedented violations of NATO airspace. In recent days,
Yeah.
Putin has
And then you
shown
saw
his
Trump
true
actually saying something that sounded, well, on the right page. Here's Trump talking about Putin's killing many people and he's losing more than he's actually killing.
He has let me down. I mean, he's killing many people and he's losing more people than he's killing. I mean, frankly, the Russian soldiers are being killed at a higher rate than the Ukrainian soldiers. But yeah, he said, let me down. He has.
Yeah. So, okay. So acknowledging facts is the first step in progress. Meanwhile, Lavrov is claiming that Moscow is open to compromise on Ukraine. Really? Okay. If Russia's legitimate security interests and the rights of Russians in Ukraine are respected, he insists that any deal must also include the recognition of Russia's stage referendum results. Okay. Well, he didn't say stage. The commentary put in stage, but so basically he's willing to compromise as long as he gets everything that he was asked for. Now, this is a pro-Russian site saying the West cherry picks principles to fit their agenda, according to Lavrov. Kosovo equals self-determination without a referendum. Remember when that broke up and with the former Yugoslavia and the Kosovo? And so the Russians still have a bee in their bonnet about Kosovo because they're very tight with Serbia. And then they point out the comparison, but Crimea, more than 90% voted for Russia, but the West cried territorial integrity. Well, yeah, that's because more than 90% voted for Russia. 90%? Really? You think that that was a legitimate election? First, it was by the point of the gun, so you can't actually tell whether that was. And then who votes for 90% of anything, anywhere in the free world? That doesn't happen. That's what happens when it's crooked. Okay. Crimea overwhelmingly voted in favor of reunification with the rest of Russia. This event was preceded by a violent Western-sponsored coup d'etat in Ukraine. No, which removed the legitimate government. No, the government fled. That's what happened. There were protests out in Maidan Square, and the president fled. And a coup d'etat, they keep talking about this as if the more they say it, the truer it becomes. But that's not it. That's not what happened. USA had its own interest in Crimea, having scouted it for a new U.S. NATO military base. I'm unaware of anything. Maybe you can point it out if you can find it. I'm unaware of anything that says that there was a U.S. NATO military base in the making in Crimea. Okay, again, Lavrov, the Americans came to understand that the people who, in protest against the oppressive Nazi regime, voted in the referendum to return to the Russian Federation will never again live under the yoke of the current Kyiv authorities. The yoke of the current Kyiv authorities. You know what life is like in the occupied territories, whether it's Crimea or the Donbass or wherever? And it's awful. Okay, and he goes on and talks about no land swaps will stop us. Russia dismisses Trump's peace plan. Okay, you're not going to do any land swaps, but you're not really gaining ground. I mean, you gained like 500 square kilometers over the last month. That's nothing. I mean, it's nothing. You gained this much land, and it cost you hundreds of thousands of your soldiers' lives this year alone. Russian foreign minister contradicted President Trump's Ukraine peace framework, stating that territorial exchanges cannot stop Moscow's military campaign. So what we know from that is that their goals have not been met. Ukraine has been able to successfully thwart them. And I call that winning. Somebody posted this, a pro-Russian account posted this. Say what you will, but Sergei Lavrov undeniably possesses a sharp sense of humor. And he's saying, at this time, we're busy meddling with Catalonia's elections. Here he is talking.
So there's a new policy now of land expropriation in South Africa that they are implementing. It's a parliamentary process. People could lose their farms without compensation. And there's talk that Russia is trying to take the gap, if you will, and lure some of those disgruntled farmers.
No. We are busy. Now, this time, we are busy with meddling with Catalonia elections.
Okay, so that's actually pretty funny, except you do meddle in elections here and elections there and elections elsewhere, and that the self-deprecating humor almost takes the edge off of that you actually do that, even if you're not doing that in Catalonia, which is part of Spain. Okay. So what else is going on here? Russia has supplied North Korea because remember, if you're that big bully, you really needed to call in little North Korea to come aid you, but they did. North Korea with nuclear submarine reactor modules, according to one of South Korea's major media outlets, which cites government sources. If true, it wouldn't be surprising, as there are a few effective mechanisms discouraging these countries. And then there are some other bad things that happen, and I want to point that out because it's not just good news for Ukraine, right? Lviv court sentenced a Ukrainian Air Force major to 15 years imprisonment for high treason and weapons charges. He spied for Russia. Major Yuri Lavrik secretly filmed his own military base and sent the videos to Russian intelligence FSB through his ex-wife living in occupied territory. Lavrik's former wife sided with the Russian occupiers in 2022 and agreed to serve as a go-between for Moscow's spies. So sometimes bad people just do bad things, or we see damage or destruction. It's not like it's a one-sided war, really. So we just got to be aware of it. But then there are bright spots. Sometimes things go the way that you want it to go. Now, I want to talk about one other issue before we're done here. Tomorrow, I'll be talking with Preston Stewart. U.S. Southern Command, Southcom, just released footage of Marines from the 22nd MEU conducting amphibious assault training operations in Puerto Rico. Why in Puerto Rico? Well, because they're looking like doing perhaps more in Venezuela, and Preston Stewart has been on top of that. So here's the actual video. It's just been released and somewhat ominous. With the little ticking sound behind it. Okay, so they're counting down to what? Toward some kind of greater conflict with Venezuela? Well, Preston Stewart and I will be talking about that. If you're not familiar with his channel, it's at Preston Stewart on YouTube. All right, last little thing I want to show you, and that's this. Beautiful colors. I don't know if they coordinated, but King Charles and Camilla and President Trump and his wife Melania, and that's a pretty good color scheme. All right. So last little bit that I want to do is give a shout out. Well, the shout out today is for Rick Lindy. He's an undergraduate YouTube member. Thank you, Rick, for your support. Thank all of you for your support. Hit that like button if you want to help this video spread. Thank you for the time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.